McDonald.
Taoiseach, December is traditionally the time of year in which we think in particular of those who are homeless, and I suppose more specifically again those citizens that are sleeping rough. We know from last week's homelessness figures that there are now more people homeless in this state than ever before. And we also know that the official figures actually understate the reality of homelessness across our society. The rough sleeper count published yesterday shows a 40% increase in the number of people sleeping rough since March. That is shocking. And if we consider, Taoiseach, all of those affected by the housing crisis, I think it's no exaggeration to say that hundreds of thousands of people across our society are affected. Up and down the country, there are families worried about whether or not they'll have a roof over their head come January. People in the private rental sector are being hit time and again with rent increases which are still exorbitantly high. And social housing, long promised, is being constructed at a snail's pace. House prices are out of control, and for young people today, owning a home is a pipe dream. And your response, Taoiseach, is to stick with the plan. Now, it may not have occurred to you, but your plan is not working. In fact, you are failing spectacularly. On last Saturday, thousands of people took to the streets of this city to tell you that, and I think it's time that you listen to them. Last week, the central bank said to would-be homeowners, those that wish to get out of the high rental trap, to wait, to hang on for new homes to be built before trying to buy. I suppose that's prudent advice and worthy advice if, of course, houses were coming on stream and if people were in a position to actually save a few bob. Week in, week out, you and the Minister for Housing and your colleagues state ad nauseam here and elsewhere to simply wait and that the houses will arrive, and yet we continue to witness the homelessness and housing crisis. We've highfalutin guarantees that new homes will sort everything out, but that they will only arrive at some undefined point into the future. The crisis is real, Taoiseach, it's in the here and now, and people are frankly fed up waiting for you to get your act together. People are being screwed day in, day out with runaway rents, and it seems that your government is incapable of meaningful action. You seem to have a speciality in empty promises. So we need something tangible that will benefit these people who are struggling now and who need a break now. So I want to put it to you, Taoiseach, that you do a decent and constructive thing to cut these people a bit of slack. I want to suggest to you that you introduce a 3-year rent freeze and a temporary tax relief for renters with immediate effect.
Thank you very much. Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, Deputy. It is indeed approaching Christmas time and the holiday season, and people are looking forward to the holidays and to Christmas and spending time with their families, spending time perhaps at home near the warmth of their fire. And of course, when people are thinking about that, one's thoughts inevitably turn to those who are less fortunate, those who don't have a home to go to, those who don't have shelter, and those who are exposed to the cold. And that's why the figures that were produced yesterday in terms of rough sleepers were very disappointing, showing that 156 people were sleeping rough on that particular night. It isn't the highest ever by any means. It was higher a year ago and was higher, in fact, 4 years ago. But it does represent an increase on the last count back in September. So what do we want to do? We want to make sure that people have access to emergency accommodation this Christmas, that nobody has to sleep rough, that there are beds available for everyone who needs them. And that's why we've set aside 60 million in the budget for additional investment in emergency accommodation. Getting people into emergency accommodation, of course, is the first step. After that, you can get them into more permanent accommodation. So we'll have an extra 203 beds put in place between now and the end of the year. In fact, 51 of those are already in place so 203 additional permanent beds and 130 contingency beds, so that there will be emergency accommodation for everyone who needs it this summer, or this winter rather. We're also continuing with Housing First, working with the Peter McVerry Trust and other charities to advance the Housing First programme. And that's all about getting people who were rough sleepers, who've gone into emergency accommodation, into a secure tenancy. And then they're given all of the additional supports that they need to hang on to that home. Because, as you'll know, rough sleeping is a complex social problem. It's not just an issue of housing. It's often issues involving addiction, mental health, physical health, other issues as well. And that makes it hard to get people to come in sometimes, and can make it hard to help them as well, even though we do the best to do so. In terms of supply, I don't think it's a case of promises anymore, Deputy. The figures on supply are very positive. The last set of numbers tells us that 5,000 new houses and apartments were built in Ireland just in the last 3 months. Between 18 and 20,000 new homes were built in Ireland this year. And those aren't just figures. That means, turning back to the theme of Christmas which you raised, this Christmas, about 20,000 people and their families will be sitting around a Christmas tree in their new home, a home that didn't exist this time a year ago. 20,000 people and their families, maybe 60, 70,000 people in total, spending this Christmas in a house or apartment that wasn't built this time last year. And what we're going to need to see next year is to ramp up that more and more until we get to 30 or 40,000, the kind of figure that we need to be building every year to get on top of this crisis.
Deputy McDonald.
So, Taoiseach, you are now, or your party is now in government 7 years. And just for the purposes of clarity, the theme that I raised wasn't Christmas so much as the theme of a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis over which you have presided. And when people take to the streets in vast numbers, it's not an easy thing to mobilise people, as I'm sure all of us are aware. But when thousands of people take to the street on the brow of Christmas with the very clear message that you are failing and that they want you to change tack, to be imaginative, to be decisive and to be brave, I think it is wise to listen to that. You mentioned Housing First as an approach. I'm very familiar with that. I'm informed by Deputy O'Brien that you plan to cater for some 200 people when in fact the need is somewhere at 3,000. And I think that's a metaphor for how short you have fallen in terms of need and in terms of public expectation. I asked you about a rent freeze, Taoiseach. I'd like you to address that question. I'd like also to put to you again that there is a need to adopt what is called the Focus Amendment to deal with the issue of landlords seeking vacant possession, to sell houses and homes over the heads of tenants. This is one of the main, if not the main, contributing factor now to homelessness and family homelessness in particular. There's two concrete, innovative, brave, decisive things that you could do if you were a Taoiseach that was minded to really get a grip on this situation. So can we have a straight answer as regards the rent freeze and indeed that amendment to law? You're familiar with it. It's known as the Focus Amendment since it was advanced by that body in the first instance.
Thanks, Deputy. You're correct to say that we're in office for over 7 years now, but what you don't say, or what you'd like us to forget or like us not to know, is that we spent 5 of those years, the first 5, putting this country back on track, getting the public finances back in order, reversing some of the awful cuts that were made to welfare and to people's pay and salaries in the years before, dealing with enormous levels of unemployment. And a set of figures came out today, and that shows that we now have unemployment in Ireland at 5.3%, at the lowest in 10 years. And that's an achievement, and something that I think those of us on this side of the House are very proud of having achieved, having got to that point where unemployment is at a 10-year low. So we spent the first 5 years really putting the country back together, getting the economy working again, getting people back to work, restoring people's incomes, giving people hope again. And we've spent the last 2 years, a little bit longer perhaps, dealing with many of the legacy issues that were caused by that very same crisis. a 7-year period during which the construction sector was dysfunctional and didn't build any homes. A 7-year period during which banks were unable to lend either to builders or to people seeking to buy a mortgage. In terms of your question on rent tax relief, no, that's not a proposal we're supporting. We have an alternative proposal which is in the finance bill, and that is, rather than just giving income tax cuts to people who are renting, we're giving them to all workers, because other people struggle with other bills. It's not just people who are renting. There are also people who are struggling to pay their mortgage. There are also people who are struggling to save for a deposit. There are also people who are struggling with childcare costs, for example. And rather than just giving tax relief to one group, which is the Sinn Féin proposal, we're going to give it to nearly everyone who's working, over 1 million people. And I'm disappointed that Sinn Féin is going to vote against that.